Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In today's episode, I want to talk about the Russian oil industry and specifically refined oil products. When we talk about oil, there are two distinct markets. We have the crude oil market, which is basically oil that's pulled out of the ground, loaded onto tankers or put into pipelines, and then exported to other countries. And when that crude oil arrives in those countries, it needs to be refined before it can be used. So it has to go through the refinery process and broken down into fuels that can be easily used, such as gasoline, kerosene, and diesel. Now, as with any added value process, it increases both the costs and the profits for the producers. So Russia's most valuable form of export in terms of oil was refined products because it was receiving a higher price and earning more profit. And also, the refinery business in Russia is huge. Russia has around 30 mega refineries, which employ tens of thousands of people. Historically, Russia's largest market for the sale of refined products was Europe. However, as a direct result of the invasion of Ukraine, the vast majority of European countries have now banned the import of refined products, so Russia has had to find new markets. But the problem that Russia has encountered is that its main markets for exporting oil are now China and India, and both of those countries have developed their own refinery systems, and they don't want to buy the finished products. They would much rather buy crude oil in its basic form, pass it through their own refineries, and then either use those higher margin products themselves or sell them in the international markets. And as a direct result of this dynamic, Russia has seen the value of its refined oil exports falling dramatically, and its profits have fallen even more. So in today's video, I want to talk about why the sanctions have had such a massive impact on the Russian treasury and why they've lost their most valuable source of revenue from the oil industry. So in today's episode, we'll have a look at refined oil products and how they're produced. We'll have a look at what's been happening to Russian crude oil, how it's being refined and then sold back to the West, which to a certain extent is circumnavigating the sanctions. However, what's happening is that the profit that Russia was previously earning from refined products is now being earned by countries like India, China, and Turkey. We'll have a look at what's happening to the oil industries in India, China, and the Middle East. And then finally today I'll wrap up with my summary as to what I think the impact of the reduction in refined oil sales is for Russia and what's likely to happen over the course of the next 3 to 6 months.
What are refined products? Refined petroleum products are fuels distilled from crude oil and other liquids. After crude oil is removed from the ground, it is sent to a refinery, where different parts of the crude oil are separated into usable petroleum products. Some examples of petroleum products include gasoline, distillates such as diesel fuel, heating oil, and jet fuel, as well as fuel oil, petrochemical feedstocks, waxes, lubricating oils, and asphalt. These refined products are then put to use in a variety of ways, such as heating, paving roads, generating electricity, and as feedstocks for petrochemical and plastics production. Most refineries focus on producing transportation fuels, the largest use category for petroleum products. Approximately 50% of all refinery output in the United States was gasoline. Distillate fuels represented the second largest category at close to 30%. So how do refineries convert oil into the various products? All refineries have 3 basic steps: separation, conversion, and treatment. During the separation process, the liquids and vapors separate into petroleum components called fractions, based on their weight and boiling point in distillation units. Heavy fractions, such as asphalt and residual fuel oil, separate lower down in the distillation unit, while the lighter fractions, such as gasoline and naphtha, vaporize and rise to the top. Following distillation, heavy fuels can be processed further through cracking to obtain higher value products. The final step in the refining process is to bring products up to pipeline and market standards through blending and treating. For instance, refineries and blenders combine gasoline blending components and ethanol to obtain finished retail gasoline.
So as you've just seen, crude oil needs to go through the refinery process to produce the finished products that we use in our vehicles and homes. And the problem that the West has is that once crude oil has been refined, it is absolutely impossible to be able to find out where that crude oil originated from. And the oil refinery industry is big business in countries like China, India, and Turkey, because you don't need to have your own oil to be refining it. You can just take delivery of crude oil, pass it through your refinery process, and that means that you're adding value, and therefore the industry can become profitable in its own right, even if a country doesn't have its own oil. And over the course of the last 12 months, a lot of these countries have been increasing their purchase of Russian crude oil because the price has been very low. It's been trading at a discount in the international markets. And that's provided the opportunity to refine this cheap raw material into the finished products and then sell those products into the countries that have banned the import of Russian oil. This chart plots the movement in the daily value of Russian refined oil exports dating back to January 2022. So as you can see, at the start of 2022, the daily value of Russian refined oil exports was around 140 million euros, so around $150 million. However, immediately following Russia's invasion of Ukraine on the 24th of February, that value rose to around 240 million euros, which is more than $250 million per day, or around $91 billion on an annualized basis. However, as you can see, over the course of the last 18 months or so, there has been a significant and continued decline in the value of Russia's refined oil exports. And that's for two reasons. Firstly, following the invasion of Ukraine, there was a backlash from Russia's major markets. A lot of European and Western countries that were previously buying gasoline and diesel and other products from Russia decided that they no longer wanted to make those purchases. So there was a reduction in the demand for Russian refined products. And in addition to that, over the course of the last 6 months or so, we have seen a reduction in market prices as a result of the global slowdown and concerns that we may be going into some form of recession. And as I mentioned at the start of the video, one of the other problems that Russia has had is that it hasn't been able to find replacement markets for the markets that it's lost. In terms of crude oil, Russia has been sending large volumes to China and India, which has partially offset the lost sales to Europe. However, China and India do not want to buy more expensive refined products. They would much rather take in the basic crude oil and then pass it through their own refineries, which obviously has a benefit for their own economies in terms of creating employment. And those countries will then either use the finished products in their own home markets or sell them into the international markets. Because it's very difficult when you're talking about refined products to be able to work out the lineage. Was it created using Russian crude oil or crude oil from some other country? So once oil is developed into a refined state, it can virtually be sold into any market in the world. So as a direct result of the fact that China and India don't want to buy refined products, Russia has seen a major drop in the value of its exports, and it's having to cut back on the amount of crude oil that it's passing through its own refinery network. And this is causing further problems for Russia, because if it's cutting back on the amount of crude oil that it's diverting into its own refinery network, it then needs to find more markets to export that crude oil into. So this is a genuine double whammy from Russia's point of view. It's losing profit because it's not selling the higher margin refined products, and it's also having to sell more crude oil, which potentially means that it will have to offer bigger discounts to make sure all the countries that are buying take on larger volumes. So if we now look at the current value of refined oil exports, you can see that Russia is currently exporting around 75 million euros of refined products per day, which equates to around $82 million or $30 billion on an annualized basis. So that means that over the course of the last 18 months, on an annualized basis, Russia has lost around $60 billion worth of revenue as a direct result of losing the ability to sell refined products rather than crude oil. This report, produced by the Centre for Research on Energy and Clean Air, claims that Western countries that have largely banned the import of oil from Russia have imported around $50 billion worth of oil products from countries that have increased their purchases of Russian oil over the last 12 months. And this chart shows a graphical presentation of how that's happened. So on the left-hand side here, you can see the crude oil, which is originating in Russia. We then have countries that have been buying it. So we've got the UAE in red at the top, Turkey in turquoise, Singapore in green, India in brown, and China in red. And the way this graphic works is that the refinery process is shown down the middle, And then on the right-hand side of the chart, we have all of the refined products that have been made using Russian crude oil that are then sold into countries such as the United States, United Kingdom, Japan, European Union, Canada, and Australia. The report states that the EU, most of the G7 and Australia have banned or limited imports of Russian crude oil and oil products, which has led to a significant fall in Russia's oil prices and export revenues. However, these price cap coalition countries have increased imports of refined oil products from countries that have become the largest importers of Russian crude. This represents a major loophole that can undermine the impact of the sanctions on Russia. 1 year on from Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the price cap coalition countries increased the imports of refined oil products from China by 3.6 million tonnes, or 94%, India by 0.3 million tonnes, or 2%, Turkey by 1.8 million tonnes, or 43%, the UAE by 23%, and Singapore by 33%. Price cap coalition country imports of refined oil products from these 5 countries rose by 10 million tonnes, or 26%, which equated to more than $20 billion, so an increase of more than 80% in value terms. The largest importer of oil products from these countries was the EU, whose imports amounted to around $20 billion. In the last 12 months, Australia has purchased around $9 billion, the USA around $7.5 billion, and the UK and Japan around $6 billion each. The highest proportions of imported oil products into oil price cap coalition countries were diesel, representing 29%, jet fuel, which represented 23%, and gas oil, which was 13%. As Russia was forced to offer discounted oil to ensure that it was able to find buyers, the countries named in this report are refining larger volumes of imported Russian crude and then export the refined products to sanction-imposing countries. This is currently a legal way of exporting oil products to countries that are imposing sanctions on Russia as the product origin has changed. However, this process still provides funds to Russia's war chest. Interestingly, 56% of Russian crude shipped to these countries has been transported by vessels owned and or insured by the price cap coalition countries. And the share of those same ships is 74% for oil products exported from the laundromat countries. There are 5 major oil refinery businesses in India. Reliance Industries Limited is the largest private sector oil refining company in India and operates 2 refineries with a combined capacity of 1.24 million barrels per day. And this company is a significant exporter of petroleum products, including gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel. Indian Oil Corporation is the largest state-owned refining company in India and operates 11 refineries with a combined capacity of 81.2 million metric tonnes per annum. This business also exports petroleum products to several countries including Nepal, Bhutan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka and Mauritius. Bharat Petroleum Company is another state-owned oil refining company in India and operates 4 refineries with a combined capacity of 38 million metric tonnes per annum. Hindustan Petroleum Corporation is another state-owned refining company which operates 3 refineries with a combined capacity of 24 million metric tonnes per annum. Mangalore Refinery and Petrochemical Limited is a subsidiary of Oil and Gas Corporation Limited and operates a refinery with a capacity of 15 million metric tonnes per annum and exports products to a variety of countries including Singapore and the United States. As we've been discussing in this video, access to cheap Russian crude has boosted output and profits at India's oil refineries and enabled them to export refined products competitively to Europe and take bigger market share. And Russia is now the single largest supplier of crude oil to India, displacing Iraq for the first time. Indian refiners, which rarely bought Russian oil previously due to high transport costs, imported between 970,000 and 981,000 barrels of oil per day, accounting for more than a fifth of overall imports. Russia's flagship grade Urals made up the bulk of India's purchases. However, refiners are also importing lighter grades from Russia's Far East and Arctic grades, such as Sokol, Arco, Novilport and Espo blend. Russia's largest oil producer Rosneft and top Indian refiner Indian Oil Corp have signed a term deal to substantially increase and diversify oil grades delivered to India. As Europe's ban kept Russian products out, India's diesel exports to the continent rose between 12 and 16%, That accounted for around 30% of India's total oil exports, up from around 21% a year earlier. The key European buyers of Indian diesel are France, Turkey, Belgium and the Netherlands. Europe accounted for around 50% of India's jet fuel exports, or around 75,000 barrels per day, which is up by around 40,000 barrels compared with the previous year. India has also boosted vacuum gas oil shipments to the USA. The US took around 12,000 barrels per day of VGO, which equates to around 80% of India's overall exports of the refining feedstock that can be processed further to produce fuels such as gasoline and diesel. This chart shows China's exports of refined oil products, and what this chart shows is there's been a significant increase in the volumes that China has been exporting. And this is predominantly as a result of the fact that China has been buying in cheap Russian crude, passing it through its own refinery system, and then selling the excess in the international markets. And if we look at the current situation, China's imports of crude oil surged to the second highest on record in March 23, capping off a strong first quarter as the world's biggest importer of the fuel reopened its economy. Customs data shows that China imported 52.3 million tonnes of crude oil in March, which is the most since the all-time high in June 2020. The amount is equivalent to 12.4 million barrels per day and brought total imports for the first quarter to 11.1 million barrels per day, a gain of 6.7% or 700,000 barrels per day from the same period in 2022. Now, originally the market viewed this increase in oil purchases as confirmation that China's economy was recovering. However, a leap in exports of refined products in the first quarter undercuts that view. Customs data shows that in March 23, refined fuel exports were 5.5 million tonnes, which works out to around 1.4 million barrels per day. And for the first quarter, China's refined product exports were up 60% to 18.2 million tonnes, equivalent to around 1.6 million barrels per day. And that compares to exports of around 1 million barrels per day in the same period of 2022, meaning that they've risen by 610,000 barrels per day over the last 12 months. Now, one thing you may be surprised about is that Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates are buying Russian oil. And initially that doesn't make any sense because both of those countries have their own oil supplies. They're some of the biggest oil suppliers in the world. So why would they be buying Russian oil? Well, the main reason is that neither of those countries have applied sanctions against Russia. And what they're doing is taking advantage of the low price of Russian oil, buying it in, and then exporting more of their own oil. So rather than using their own oil themselves, they're using Russian oil and increasing the amount that they're selling because obviously their own oil isn't subject to sanctions. So this is a perfectly legal way of both of these countries finding a way around the sanctions. Russian oil exports to the UAE have more than tripled over the course of the last 12 months to a record 60 million barrels, and Russia now exports an average of 100,000 barrels per day to Saudi Arabia and equates to more than 36 million barrels per year and compares to almost zero before the outbreak of the Ukraine war. The price of Urals crude oil is more than 30% lower than Brent crude due to the price caps and other sanctions imposed by the West. Arbitrage opportunities for the Gulf countries are even more pronounced in refined products such as naphtha, fuel oil and diesel. And over the course of the last year, Saudi Arabia has increased its diesel exports to France and Italy, two countries that previously relied heavily on Russia for those imports. According to the recent report, Saudi Arabia's imports of discounted fuel from Russia have largely met demand in its domestic market, and the country has been able to free up large amounts of diesel for exports to other regions. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video really to give you more of an insight as to what's happening with Russia's oil exports. It's been well documented that Russia has vastly increased its exports of crude oil to China and India, which has partially offset all of the lost sales to the West. And at face value, this looks like the impact on the Russian economy shouldn't actually be that bad because Russia has pivoted and is now selling all of its oil directly to the East rather than the West. However, when you dig down into the details, there are a number of flaws in that argument. Firstly, Russia is having to sell its oil at a discount in order to encourage India and China Firstly, to take large volumes, and secondly, not to listen to the West in terms of telling them not to buy Russian oil. They're having to encourage them to make those purchases by offering it at a discount of around $20 per barrel. So that means that even though Russia may be selling the same volume of oil, the actual value of the oil is significantly lower because it's having to cut the price. And in addition to that price cut, there's also been a fall in the international price of oil over the course of the last 6 months or so. So that's had a double impact on Russia's revenues. And it's estimated that the value of Russia's crude oil exports has fallen from around $200 million per day back at the start of 2022 to around $100 million per day, which on an annualized basis is a loss of around $40 billion worth of revenue. However, when you look at the situation for refined products, it is much more serious. As we've talked about in today's video, India and China don't want to buy refined products. They don't want to pay for expensive goods when they can make them themselves. They're taking in Russian crude oil, passing it through their own refinery networks, and successfully producing all of the finished products. Previously, Russia was selling most of its refined products to wealthy countries in Europe, but those wealthy countries no longer want to buy it, and the markets that Russia is now identifying don't want to pay high prices for refined products. And as a direct result of that, the value of Russian refined product exports has fallen from around $250 million per day to around $80 million per day. So that's a direct loss of income of around $40 billion over the course of the last 12 months. But the impact on the Russian economy is much more serious than that, because Russia has a huge refinery network. It has built mega refineries all over Russia. And the reason that Russia built those refineries is because refined products are much more lucrative. They can make much more profit selling gasoline and diesel than they can crude oil. So that was the end of the market that Russia wanted to be in. It wanted to be a high-end producer of high-value goods. But what's happened as a direct result of the sanctions is that Russia is no longer playing in that market. China and India have stepped in. They're taking cheap Russian crude oil, passing it through their own networks and benefiting by making all of the profit themselves. So Russia has tried to find a loophole in the sanctions by selling more crude oil into India and China. But effectively what that's done is pushed Russia further back down the food chain. They're no longer eating at the top table in terms of making all that lucrative profit from refined products. They've passed that mantle over to India and China, who are happily using cheap, discounted Russian crude to make their own refined products. And Russia has now become a basic provider of crude oil to the world. And that's having a double impact on the Russian economy. Firstly, the lost sales from all of those refined products. But secondly, and potentially more importantly, it's now seeing a massive reduction in its refinery business. That means that people who are employed in those refineries are potentially going to be made redundant. People who are retained could see a cut in their income, and that will have a negative multiplier effect throughout the whole of the Russian economy, because those people will no longer be spending in their local markets, and that has a domino impact. So the overall summary of today's video is that the sanctions that have been applied against Russian oil are working. Russia has tried to find a way around it. It is managing to sell large volumes of crude oil to countries such as India and China. However, it's lost its most valuable source of revenue. It's no longer able to sell anywhere near the volume of refined products that it did historically, and that's having a huge impact on the Russian economy. So hopefully you found today's episode useful, informative and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end, and here's something to put a smile on your face.